thank you very much for, deeply informed, the real world doesn't impinge on philosophers often, and we appreciate, people who, bring us anthropological insights from it. And, I need them, you're right. I wonder a little bit if we might not be thinking of two different worlds. So I'm thinking, at least in part, and maybe in most important part, of how to influence the public, and through the public, the various co-implementers that I was talking about. And you were working more from the other end, thinking, the guys that I used to sit in those rooms with and have to sort of negotiate with, and especially at international level, they were so stubborn and acting on instructions from the Foreign Office. You just couldn't, they didn't have any latitude to negotiate. I mean, it was a hopeless conversation. So, both of those are important bits of the story. But the end run around your bit of the story, as you yourself said, was to get some traction on the mass public in elections, and so maybe you're right. Maybe I should sort of emphasize that side more and get at the co-implementers, the stakeholders, by way of elections more. But I wonder if we're not also thinking of slightly different worlds as our main paradigm case, in that you're thinking of environmental policy where a lot of money's on the table, and the causal mechanisms and preferred tools, very complicated scientific questions. You can genuinely say, look, we share the same values, but my instrument's better than your instrument, and I'll show you why. And it's a long, 7-page computer program that shows me why, and I don't know what to make of that. That's your paradigm, and there I can see that ethics might not immediately, shine a bright light on one particular solution and say, look, that's it, guys. If you really want to be ethical, that's the only thing you can do. In your world, that might not be a common experience. But now think of the place where all this works best, and that's human rights advocacy. Well, best is comparative, I mean, but there it's pretty clear what's the right thing to do, and it might be hard to figure out how to get your hands on tyrants who are really dedicated to not doing the right thing. But surprisingly often, the Madres and the Plaza de Mayo, can shame the guys into relenting, or anyway mobilize some people in some other countries to bring pressure to bear on the guys who've engaged in these human rights violations, to stop or anyway slow down their human rights violations. So, maybe there are sort of cases where it's easier and cases where it's harder in both these dimensions to play the ethics card successfully in making policy. Why don't I just leave it at that and see if first you would like to come back and then anybody else?
The human rights example is one of those examples where I think which explain more what I said than what you said, because most of the people are for protecting human rights, but reality is very different. For instance, in the United States, you do not find any, let's say, consensus of stopping the death penalty, which is in our, for instance, in our European context, which is not something which would be according to human rights. And we have a lot of different examples. So my main argument is not that if you have a certain measure already decided, if within the political process you have a certain, let's say, problem, even if you have a certain decision on restrictions, if you then go into the implementation, maybe morality here plays a role, and certainly also practical rationality, which is the case for the traffic light example. It is, for instance, not the case in Germany for speed limits. Everybody is against, let's say, dangers in the normal circulation and in driving cars. But you will not find a consensus if you use moral arguments to agree on a speed limit. This is a case. So my argument, I think, and here we do not disagree, ethical norms play a role, but they do not necessarily help to find concrete consensus on a certain way to contribute to these values. It's, for instance, let give you another example: climate policy, climate change. And the beginning of the discussion on climate change and climate policy was always a moral argument that the northern countries have the responsibility, they have contributed most to the CO2 emissions. So they have to do something, and the other countries say, well, we will do nothing, but you have first to go ahead. I think this moral discussion is a big barrier for an active climate policy, because it would be economically and also from the ecological point of view beneficial for also for the countries in the south to go to an active climate policy, which is not the case. Or the United States is the same. So you cannot, and that's the, if I may say so, the problem with your presentation, and I read the paper, you have very few examples of what kind of moral arguments you mean. You have the two examples of the traffic light and of these ice vendors. These are very practical things. And even this ice issue, it's normal that people have profited. They have first, they bought this ice, and then when these two people were arrested, they applauded. So I do not really see that if you look at the entire policy cycle, that you can give examples where the framing always is not the objective, is not the ethical norm, but the framing is to look at the problem, how you can solve it. Is it a problem of overregulation, or is it a problem of a different kind?
Okay, look, I mean, you can't expect morality to give you an answer as to what precise number ought to be set as the speed limit on the Autobahn, right? But you can get a principle that, look, reckless endangerment of other people is immoral.
No,
you know?
It's not the case.
Well, you can get the principle agreed. I mean, you can't get a number agreed, right?
We do not disagree about the number. We disagree in Germany since decades about the fundamental problem of a speed limit is needed. So we have a lot of speed limits if there is a dangerous situation at a certain in a certain area, or we have speed limits because of too much noise and noise abatement and so. But there is no agreement about a general speed limit in Germany. And you can use so many moral arguments for that. You will not, this will not help to find a consensus on that, at least at the moment. Or not the moment, but during the last I do not know, 30 years or so. Maybe we will invite our audience to give some.
Give us a number for the speed limit, please.
Yeah.
I've been more than 30 years involved in this business of diplomacy and mainly bilateral, but also multilateral to some extent. Just wanted to maybe raise one area where ethics and morality might be a little bit more potent, though certainly not invincible or not all powerful. But it's the area of disarmament, and two examples from my own country's history spring to mind. It was an Irish resolution at the United Nations in the late 50s that ultimately gave rise to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, there was an example, I think, of where disarmament, it seems to me, is a classic area where most countries are motivated by, well, a combination of the fear of what will happen if disarmament doesn't work, or if arms proliferation or whatever gets out of control. There's a sort of a fear of the consequences for smaller countries. But secondly, there's a sort of an ethical consideration as well that these sort of weapons are morally difficult to justify. And then against that, you have the inhibiting factors, which are the interests of particular countries, particularly powerful countries and military alliances, which do not want to go down the road or suspect the other side, and therefore not willing to engage in disarmament activities or act as a brake on disarmament efforts. In the case of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, it actually succeeded in producing a treaty which has not been fully respected, but it's still a major piece of international legal architecture, and it stems, I would say, from a combination of moral imperatives and, on the one hand, and the interests of states on the other. And I think that's where the game has to be played. It is to find the intersection between the moral impulse on the one hand and the practical interests that need to be defended on the other. And then the second example is more recently, about 4 or 5 years ago, my government came up with the idea, along with other governments, of promoting an international agreement to ban anti-personnel landmines, which again, we don't produce these landmines, we don't use them, they're not used in Ireland or unlikely to ever be used in Ireland in the foreseeable future. So again, the motivation there was largely moral, but we managed to find a consensus, at least to get the agreement finalized, and it's open for, and I think it's now coming to force, in fact. I don't know the details, I can't recall the details exactly, but nonetheless, again, it was a case where a moral imperative came into play and was effective to some extent, though not fully, because a number of key countries are not members of this agreement and have said they will not join the agreement. Therefore, they have practical reasons from their own perspective why they refuse to go along with it. And then the final example that I would ask about would be the European Union. To what extent is and I'm former Director General of the European Union Division in Dublin, and to what extent do moral principles or moral suasion operate within the European Union to condition the behaviour of states? In my experience, the answer is to some extent. In other words, there are certain moral norms that governments feel they have to abide by. It doesn't mean they will always abide by them, because sometimes they're constrained to move in another direction. But I wonder whether the European Union could be considered as an area for the examination of the impact of ethical and moral principles on the formation of policy. Because we do have this, what you referred to earlier about the sort of clubability that develops within the European Union, the fact that everyone feels they're a member of a club and want to abide by the principles and the norms of that club, because otherwise, even though you can be nasty, you can impose a veto, you can behave in a very self-interested manner, but you know that ultimately in the future you will need the help of others in order to get something that you want, which is vital to your interests. And therefore I think we always have to behave in a way that is, at least we have to take cognizance of the importance of respecting the views of others and respecting certain moral and ethical principles. I just wonder if you have any sort of comment to make on those two examples.
You are very right, and I'm grateful for your contribution, because it shows that, and it's I also agree to that the values after a certain time, the awareness for instance, for the need or for the positive effect of European integration or for arms control. This is a normal process that after a certain time, and if these kind of norms are, let's say, put into the general discussion, this will help to find a consensus. I think that's why I said I think that norms and ethics play an important role in decision making. The question is whether they will help when in the beginning you have controversial and different interests. And this is, in the long run, these kind of norms play a role. And if we succeed to convince let's say, the majority within Europe or even in a unanimous situation, that these changes are needed, then it's fine. But this is not the argument, I think, that norms play a role. And if we have a consensus, we have a consensus, yes. But the argument is, I understood that norms help to find a consensus, even in those cases where there is a controversial attitude in the beginning. Isn't that your argument?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly believe in repeat play, shaping behavior in these ways, and that surely is very important in the real world. But the interesting thing, in a way, with these experiments is that even in one-shot games, people say, look, there is a right thing to do, and I'm prepared to spend some money to make sure the right thing is done. So it's, even in the very first instance, not just in the repeat plays, that these things can get going. I mean, I don't know quite what's going to happen with Europe, and you tell me. But if you can, but in a few weeks we might know. But I like the other examples. I mean, the disarmament and the landmine ban, and we just, that reminded me of another one that, of course, we should have on the table, which is the anti-slavery movement in earlier centuries. I mean. There was some interest on the table, and people just said, look, this is a moral principle. Don't talk to me about interest.
But the slavery, the anti-slavery, was solved because there was a long period of fight and struggle. And after a certain while, fortunately, the majority, even not the unanimity, was convinced that slavery is a bad thing. But it was not from the beginning that, and this again I understood is your argument, that if you use these moral arguments, you will convince those who are in the beginning not of the same opinion. This is I think our controversial discussion. We have a.
My name is Kai Wickler from the faculty. I don't need a microphone, I think. Please. We need a mic. We need Okay, is it on? Yeah, is it working? I found the talk very, very interesting, and after the comment I was wondering, what are we actually talking about? And to Edda Müller, my question is your point actually that you want to qualify the scope condition of the argument that ethics, norms, and these kinds of things can matter? So it matters somehow, but we have to take into account institutional rules, what kind of bargaining situation are we in, what are the material interests there? Or is your argument that we have to be more careful, and sometimes ethical norms have a counterproductive effect? So putting them on the table have a counterproductive effect. I think this would be somewhat different ways of looking at that. Second point I would like some clarification is what are the kind of domains we are talking about? And I think that there are quite a huge difference between, on the one hand, national or international negotiations, and we need to discuss what the role of norms in coming to a consensus in international negotiations is on the one hand, and compliance behavior of individuals or companies in a given set of policies. And I think we have to distinguish between those. Two very brief points on both. I think on negotiations, at least Fritz Scharpf claimed that the prior agreement on rules of distributive justice can enhance the consensus, the finding of consensus in negotiations. So general agreements on these rules and norms could facilitate consensus if you then allow to have negotiations more on the problem-solving aspects of that. But I think Professor Goodin's point was more on the enforcement compliance of policies. And here, I think it's quite clear that social norms, interpretations of ethics do influence compliance behavior. There was a great example from a student out of the class today. She said she came from Australia to Berlin, Germany, and her behavior in terms of paying for public transport has changed because the system seems reasonable. It's not expensive, it's working fine, so let's pay. While you have hefty fines in Australia, and obviously not such a good system, so I don't know if the person itself had changed the compliant behavior, but in terms of the view on that. So in that sense, I think these norms do influence compliance behavior. Maybe we can try to be more precise under which conditions that is the case, and if that applies to the whole population or to some parts of the population of, regulatees. Thank you.
Well, your two questions. My argument, at least I understood, that ethics should help, or morality should help, to overcome controversial political debates. So not the compliance and the implementation of an already agreed legislation. Here I'm absolutely agree. If you, by majority, for instance, you decide on a legislation and you do not find compliance within because the general public is convinced that this must be done, then it's difficult to implement that. But this is we're talking about the policy cycle of decision making in beforehand. That's at least what I understood. And here, my argument is that norms help to bring a certain issue on the agenda, but that does not necessarily helps to find a consensus on a certain measure let's say, to overcome or to solve a problem. Because again, you can discuss how you would protect, let's say, the climate or reduce CO2 by voluntary agreements, by binding standards, by taxation, whatsoever, by emission trading, and so on and so on. And here, normally, in the political debate, this struggle starts. And the general, let's say, the consensus about the norm, about the objective, about the need to do something against CO2 emissions is not sufficient, normally. Secondly, what you said about what Fritz Schaff said, that it's helpful to have agreed rules when you start negotiations. That's right. But the problem is, for instance, United Nations, where you need unanimous decisions, very often there is a long debate and about the rules. What kind of rules should be applied? You know that. For instance, if you talk about the role of, for instance, the Global Environmental Facility. So there's a big discussion among, everybody does agree that money is needed to help certain, but how this Global Environmental Facility would be managed is highly controversial. So the question is always hen and egg. So you will not have an ethical norm which comes down from heaven and everybody is convinced.
I mean, I think you were very helpful in reminding me of what my point should have been, and the gap that opened up between us without me noticing, and thank you for that. I was framing this as a compliance game on both levels, compliance of the public with policies agreed, compliance with of companies and whatnot, with and people required to implement the policy among powerful stakeholders, among a policy that's been enacted. So you're quite right that talking about the making of policy is slightly different. Now, it could be that that the same problems arise at both levels, but you're quite right that we were talking a little bit past each other, and we should be drawn on that. I guess I was assuming your comment about how ethics aren't sent down from heaven unambiguously written in stone that we all interpret the same way. I mean, I guess I was sort of assuming they were, really. I mean, it's a true confession. Or anyway, I was assuming that people, certainly on the streets, and even if they're allowed to by the instructions of their government, around the big tables in the basement of the UN, actually have two preferences, one of them driven by private variable interests that are theirs alone, or they're shared with a very few people. But the other is a sort of basic ethical fundamental principles anyway. They're pretty similar. Anyway, they're a lot more similar than are the diverse interests that guide people. And if you can somehow prime people to be thinking in those terms rather than those terms, then you're going to find easier consensus. And consensus is your bugbear. So, phrase it in those terms. You can find easier consensus on ethics than on interest-based policies. Now, it's not to say that people won't disingenuously, dress up interest as ethics, which is what happened in the slave debates in the early years, and it's just a matter of people saying rubbish at that point, and saying, look, that's just disingenuous. That's just interest dressed up as ethics, and we're not going to listen to that. Now, most people can recognize interest dressed up as ethics. You see it all the time in the basement of the UN. And, the guys around the table will be the first to acknowledge that. I mean, they just, can't, they're under instructions. They can't act on their own principles. Fair enough. But
I think it would be very interesting also here for the Hertie School of Governance to take some examples. For instance, of political argumentation when you have to solve a problem. You will find that all different opinions will use the same moral arguments of how what they should do. So, for instance, to create jobs, to protect, let's say, the family or whatsoever, you will always have the same moral arguments, but the solutions they would like to bring through are very different. And here the problem starts. That's again my main argument. Everybody is for let's say, protecting children. Everybody is for protecting animals, but then they will go into the concrete issues where you need consensus, because you have to agree on constraints, you have to agree on burdens that you have to put on the shoulders of somebody, and here the controversial discussion starts. If those values and those solutions are, let's say, agreed, because in the society and because of the political, and I gave this example because the ruling party would like to win elections, then you may come to a certain agreement on that. But not because the moral argument is decisive, but because the framework conditions are decisive, and you will not have any opposition in that case. The question is whether moral arguments can persuade opposition to agree to certain measures and certain policies.
We should probably get some student stuff as well. I know that Klaus is on.
Thank you. Is this on? Yeah. I'm Carsten Schubert. I'm a PhD candidate in social philosophy, and I have a question for you, Mr. Goodin. If I got you right, let me try to reconstruct the argument. You have two spheres. You have the sphere of ethics and moral on the one side, where you have like kind of a universally shared understanding or consensus, and then you have the sphere of politics, where there's disagreement. And then you are saying, okay, in the sphere of politics, if we take an orientation on this other sphere of ethics, then we can like transfer this consensus from ethics to politics, and we can solve the problems in politics. I think that's more or less how it works structurally.
Yeah.
And I am quite skeptical about two premises in that. In the first place, that you can have this separation between these two spheres of ethics and politics. I would try to think about all this way more merged up, and connected to that, a second premise that the sphere of ethics itself can be constructed as a universal agreement, as something we all can come to a consensus. And I'm very skeptical about these two premises, and so would you claim them?
Okay. I wouldn't have framed it as ethics and politics as the two spheres. I would frame it as ethical preferences and self-interested preferences or material preferences or something like that. And politics is the way of negotiating between the two, and what we're trying to do in politics, if you follow my recommendations, is make people think in ethical terms rather than self-interested terms exclusively, or at least more in ethical terms than self-interested terms. So I agree that politics is the place you mush it up, though I see more of a sort of switching function in people's, back of people's minds, maybe more mass public than negotiators at the UN, fair enough, but more a switching function that people either see, the old lady or the rabbit when they see that picture that you always get in science experiments. So politics is the arbiter between the two, and not one of the competing spheres. I agree that you probably don't get anything like universal agreement, even within the ethical sphere, even within a given culture or country, but you get a lot more similarity, a lot fewer options within the ethical sphere at levels of broad principle that actually have some fairly practical consequences. I mean, there are certain policies that you cannot argue for in the same ethical terms without just sounding plain silly, right? Of course, you can always cook up some sort of, Jesuitical, ethical story about how torturing animals is really good for them, but, really, come on. It's just not going to wash. So I think all that I really meant to be claiming is that you have, fewer options ethically, you have more of a consensus ethically, not you have a perfect consensus ethically.
But do you really think that in the political life, moral arguments at the moment do not play a role? So you have to teach them that they should ground their arguments on moral to find to come to a better policy. That seems to be.
Well, I think so take the financial crisis. I mean, what's the Occupy movement all about except saying, look, these guys are just talking economics, we're talking morals.
Well, but
maybe they're not saying that very successfully.
Well, this is a good example. You will not certainly solve the financial crisis by talking about morality.
Well, we're not solving it by talking about economics, are we?
Well, in the long run.
That's it.
Yeah.
That is a strong statement. I mean, some people believe that is possible. I wanted to, from a sociological perspective, to bring up one term that has not appeared in the debate, and that is the policy instrument widely used in political discourses of shaming. you can discredit someone, and we all know that some arguments from interest are not going to work because the chain of naming, blaming, shaming will have disastrous consequences for those who make an argument from interest and nothing but interest. And for instance, the open method of coordination at the European level relies largely on compliance due to shaming. You would be considered a highly immoral agent if you say certain things or give reasons of a certain sort, and therefore you don't do this. This is a moral discipline that plays at the international level, and it plays at the level of household consumption. Some things you simply do not buy if you are in your right mind. And certainly if your neighbors see that you buy them or consume them or dump them into the waste or whatever. And even the concept of interest, as Danny Roderick has reminded us recently, is not self-evident and self-understood. You can have an interest not to be blamed and shamed in moral terms, and that refines your concept of interest. So maybe there is not just the multi-motive game present in many everyday situations where you have partly interest and partly moral considerations, but there is a circular causation between the two, that your conception of what your interest is includes a definition of pursuing a line of action for which you cannot be shamed. And I think, political scientists do not use very much the concept of shame, but I think it is a powerful social reality. And that speaks for Professor Goodin's view that moral considerations are an essential component of everyday behavior, both of non-elites as well as of elites. Elites do not want to be shamed.
Well, I agree. I do not say that morality doesn't play a role in decision making. My argument is that it doesn't help if there are strong controversial issues. And to take this open coordination tool from the European Union, it helps because this is my argument, and as a political scientist, because there is political competition. There's competition, for instance, between majority in Germany and opposition. So they take this and saying, we have to change this. And they are discussing within the, let's say, to try to change a majority. So it's in this case, it plays a role. But again, I do not know whether it was a too restricted interpretation from your argument. I understood that you say using grounding, and you had some quotations there, grounding politics in ethical norms will help, and it will persuade everybody who even is not of that opinion that he has to change and to behave accordingly to this ethics. And that, again, I do not see any evidence that this really works.
Just to shaming, I would add hypocrisy is discrediting, right? I mean, it's just a variation on the same theme that, sure, people can dress up as a moral argument, all sorts of interests, but it just is self-defeating because it's seen to be hypocritical.
But as Kant knew, hypocrisy can have a civilizing function. You have to stick to what you proclaimed.
Indeed, once you proclaim it, you're stuck.
Yeah. Very good. I think we have time for one more question. There you go.
I seem to have a problem with something you, if I understood it correctly, both agree actually on, and that is when you're treating morals, ethical principles, and something universally shares, more or less homogeneous among people generally. And I think this is not we do have universal moral instincts, but when they operate on a more in a specific social situations, they're very much more complex. So to those situations to which policies apply, the same basic ethical instincts can be channeled into very much different solutions to particular social problems. So your example, but providing employment, protecting families, that does not explain why certain policies are chosen and why other policies are not. And when political parties appeal to certain constituencies, those constituencies vary very much. And they're all moral people, but they have very different values articulated when it comes to certain problems.
I don't want to cut anybody off. Is anybody else who wants to come in with a last comment? That's not okay. So, yeah, the lady back there. Yes. And please introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm Riccardo. I'm a second-year MPP student. I wanted to thank you, Mr. Goodin, for giving the lecture to mostly MPP students, a school of future policy makers or thinkers about policies. Because I think this school lacks thinking about ethics and morality when we talk about the perfect policy or how to come close to getting to good policy making. And I'm glad that you brought this issue up and urged my fellow students to take this into consideration, because I agree that when it comes to compliance, I completely agree that if people share the same ethical understandings, that they're more likely to comply with laws that are that come into practice, but also in a more normative way, that it's actually worthwhile considering ethical considerations when making political decisions. And I would actually go as far as arguing that the lack of this is one of the issues that we face, that people don't vote anymore, that they're losing confidence in democracy or in the political institutions that we have in our democracies, in our liberal democracies, exactly because of that, because they're lacking the ethical bit. And so I thank you for bringing it up, and just on a last note to say I agree.
Okay. Thank you. Yes. Do you still want to pick up the question from the...
Look, I mean, I think what you're saying is what I was trying to get at with the shorthand. You know, you don't expect ethics to give you a number for a proper speed limit. So you're right. I mean, at various levels, you have to fill in details about which ethics, is silent or at most suggestive. And, in all sorts of complicated policy situations, basically the ethics will say, look, this is the outcome you have to achieve. What's the science for how to achieve it? Well, don't ask ethics. It's a genuine dispute within science, and fine. But it probably still helps, and I think maybe this is addressing themes you were pointing out. It still helps to say, look, let's remember why we're arguing about the science, right? It's because there is actually something ethically really important at stake. And, the ethical principles actually constrain our search within the science. It's not just following science wherever it leads. We're asking a question of science that's motivated by, an ethical concern. And so there are some things, even if it would work well, that might not actually be ethically on the table. I've written, in the environmental sphere, an argument against economic incentives for environmental regulation, trying to evoke an old sort of analogy, calling this, this is selling indulgences again, selling environmental indulgences. If you think the environment is not yours to sell, it's sort of like selling, the grace of God. You want to be forgiven your sins, just pay me some money. But, if you think that is an appropriate analogy, then there are certain sort of policies that, however scientifically, economically effective, ought to be off the table. So I think even if if we are just technocratically filling in the details of how to get it done, that it probably is still worth remembering what the ethical frame is in which we're doing it. And not least because we need to give people, reminders of why, this is actually a morally important business politics. Why this policy-making stuff isn't something you just kick to the technocrats and hope for the best. It's something that we all have to be involved in and interested in and take responsibility for. It's a moral matter. It's not just a technocratic matter. So thanks for that.
I think it would be certainly a good last point for consensus. I certainly agree that we need more moral and ethical norms in policy making. I totally agree. We fight for Transparency International at Derby. We fight for avoiding corruption, for instance, for making the political decision more transparent. So we would like to change, to improve, let's say, behavior of, let's say, politicians, the major group in our society. This is what we try to achieve, and we all should work towards this aim. What I talked about was what the reality is at the moment, and doesn't help to say if you only use moral arguments, then this will help to find a consensus. If there is let's say consensus on moral ethic and ethical norms, then that's fine, and then we would not have any controversial debate. But unfortunately, it's not yet the case in many fields of policy where we have a lot of problems. Let's take the financial issue. What's the problem is at the moment of solving the financial crisis? It's, for instance, the fact that we have within the European Union and also at the international level no consensus about the need to do, let's say, on a global scale, to agree on certain regulation. Take the United Kingdom position on financial transaction taxation. So this is a fact. We all have to work towards a higher degree of morality and ethical norms in policy making. This is absolutely clear, and I think here we agree.